Okay, let's get started. Want to do a bunch of things, right, this lecture, and there'll be a lot of them. So, let me see. I guess, first of all, I want to figure out how many people here are still on the wait list and not yet in the class. So if we could have a poll on the iClickers of how many people are still in on the wait list. And 98, 101, 102, 103. Okay, put them here. All right. Okay, so we now have 4 people who are still not in the class, but on the wait list. And if you could come up afterwards and tell me who you are, I'll then try to figure out what's going wrong, because there definitely are more than 4 slots, left in the, right, definitely more than 4 slots still open in the class. We have our sections, office hours. So far for 2 weeks, I've had office hours from 2 to 4 up in Evans Hall 601. And so far in 2 weeks, I've gotten 4 people who want help getting in off the wait list, and 3 people who want to talk about the course. And that's not enough. And I understand that in the past, say back before they painted Evans Hall, back when it was still kind of raw concrete with no paint at all, just kind of bare concrete, especially in the days when the concrete skin was flaking off. And so you would look on it, and it looked like it had a really bad case of acne and needed Accutane or something. And then there was the year when people got annoyed trying to open and shut the windows, which got jammed because they were low-quality windows. And I think 3 times these 4-foot by 4-foot panes of glass came off their runners and went spinning out, falling down on the ground beyond from a height of, say, 70 feet in the air. No undergraduates or graduate students were hurt. But we could understand why people didn't really want to come to office hours in Evans in those days. But now we have a freshly painted Evans, we have redone windows, it's now in very attractive colors, so it no longer looks quite as much like the Ministry of Truth from 1984. And yet still, you people aren't coming. And one possibility is that usually I get undergraduates, because usually something like 2/3 of the undergraduates who take my courses are either engineering majors or Haas majors who are naturally already higher up on the hill than Evans Hall is, and so since they're walking downhill, it's easy. But if most of you are people who spend your lives revolving around Telegraph and Bancroft, it's a climb, especially if the elevators are jammed and you have to walk up the 6 flights because the elevator never comes. So I'm thinking of adding more office hours down here, probably on the patio outside the Free Speech Movement Cafe. When would you be likely to come if I were to add office hours either before or after lecture on either Tuesday or Thursday? If I can add 1 office hour time to my existing ones, which would people like to see? Because, 3 undergraduates in 2 weeks for a class of this size is not enough. I understand that a lot of Berkeley education is relatively anonymous, that this is kind of like the Costco of universities, rather than the, I don't know what, Macy's or the Neiman Marcus or the Nordstroms of universities. But still we have our pride. Oh, damn. All right, it looks like Tuesday afternoon is probably the thing that's going to get the most. So let me try not next week. Next week I have a pointless bureaucratic meeting Tuesday afternoon after class. But let me try afterwards, going from lecture straight over to the Free Speech Movement Cafe at 12:30 on Tuesday afternoons and see who shows up, whether that's a good thing to add to this course. And let me mark that as the thing that I'm actually going to do. Additional problem set 2. Problem set 2 is now up on the internet, and it's due Thursday, February 3rd at the beginning of lecture. It's also simple and relatively easy to do, problem set 2. And again, the hope is that almost everyone will get almost everything on it right. And as for problem sets in general, I wouldn't sweat it. I think that problem sets are going to be worth 4 points per problem set. And, you know, it's of those 4 points, you don't hand it in, you get a 0. You hand it in late, you get a 1. You leave large chunks of it blank, you get a 2. You do it perfectly, you get a 4. Everyone else gets a 3. And you can get up to 2 points per problem set by regularly clicking your iClicker, whether your answer is right or wrong. So I think that everyone should wind up getting pretty much perfect scores on their problem sets, provided they hand them in on time, and provided that they actually don't leave near virtually the entire thing blank. So I want you to do them. I don't want you to go absolutely crazy over them. And I wouldn't greatly sweat them if you have other important things to do. They're points, but you can make up those points with iClickers. And it shouldn't be failing to answer question 8 on problem set 5 shouldn't be a big negative impact on your grade. However, I do want you to learn things from the problem sets. And one thing it seems to me would be good to do that usually works in these classes is to have recapitulations, to reinforce in your brains the things I really want you to know and take away for the rest of your life from this course. And one of them is how much bigger total world GDP is now than it was 10,000 years ago. That in this 10,000 years of agriculture and industrial and now post-industrial society, we've seen human populations expand from 5 million to 7 trillion. We've also seen the world get richer. How much richer? How much do we think world GDP today is? Very roughly, very approximately, is larger than it was back 10,000 years ago. Back when cities had names like Catalhayuk and had maximum populations of, say, 1,000. And yes, we are now up at 87% with what I regard as the right answer. About 17,000-fold increase in global world real GDP. Populations are about 1,200 times larger than they were 10,000 years ago. Average standards of living are about 14 times bigger than they were 10,000 years ago. Multiply those things together, you get 17,000. Although it is somewhat a silly question, what the answer is really does depend on what your tastes and preferences are, and everybody is different. And furthermore, we living in this society have very different tastes and preferences to large degrees than our hunter-gatherer predecessors of 10,000 years ago. And making such comparisons should kind of scare you. They do require enormous leaps of assumption and imagination. Second thing I want you to remember for the rest of your lives is what the unemployment rate was when you were taking IAS 107. So once again, what's the unemployment rate right now? And for this, 10 seconds should be enough. More people showing up, which is good. Yes! We got it. I'm still accepting answer B because that's the seasonally unadjusted unemployment rate in December because of this traditional standard 0.3 of a percentage point wedge caused by the fact that December is a high employment month because of the Christmas rush. And let me warn you that in 8 days, that number is going to change. Because in 8 days, the Bureau of Labor Statistics will release its survey of the unemployment rate as it was in the second week of January. And so the latest unemployment number will probably be a little bit different from 9.4%. It'll probably be 9.3% and then stay there for a month or so. But this is a question, the answer to which can change. Third thing I want you to know about is Say's law. Right? That is Jean-Baptiste Say's claim back in 1803 that we really didn't have to worry about an economy lacking demand. Because if there's deficient demand for some goods, there has to be equal excess demand for other goods, because nobody plans to sell anything without planning to buy something else useful as well. And as John Stuart Mill pointed out back in 1829, there's something deeply wrong with Say's law. What is it? Yes, the answer I want you to give is B. That the thing wrong is that people spend their incomes not just on currently produced goods and services, but on financial assets as well by building up their stock of financial assets. And the other four answers are reasonable ones as parts of theories of why there are depressions, why there are times of high unemployment. But B is, I think, the central crux of any model of why we're undergoing a period of high unemployment like we are now. And B is what I want engraved on your brains. In some ways that Say's law might be true. Or might be nearly true, is itself an astonishing claim. That is, my old teacher back when I took a course that I guess is best thought of as a combination of Political Economy 100 and also IAS 102, Methodology of the Social Sciences. Back then, we had two teachers for the section. Jeff Weintraub, now at the University of Pennsylvania, and Shannon Stimson, now in our political science department. And Jeff sent me a quote last week from a book by Cambridge, England economist Frank Hahn and Stanford economist Kenneth Arrow, General Competitive Analysis, about how the very idea that you could have an unplanned, decentralized economy where everyone runs around and does what they think is best to get themselves more wealth, how it can possibly be that this can add itself up and be coherent and organized rather than simply a total sea of chaos. So in some ways, the surprising thing is not that Say's law is false, but that it is so close to being true. And that even when Say's law is false in theory, a skillful technocratic government can, with minor interventions in the economy, make it true enough in practice for it to be a reasonable guide. And indeed, something like Say's law, that big problems of the economy not having too much demand, of the economy being disorganized in the sense that people are making lots of things that they cannot sell, this has been a big problem in the American economy, I'd say only 3 times since World War II. Very briefly in 1974-75, rather longer in 1982-84, and unfortunately for us, in 2008, and it now looks like the depths of the downturn will stretch out until 2012, since we got some more bad news this morning about the state of the labor market. But still, that's only 10 years out of 65, during which a shortage of demand has been a big problem. That means that 80% of the time we should be worrying about other things, one of which is long-run economic growth. We have John Stuart Mill's explanation of why Say's law is false. That there is, looking at this picture, another natural question about John Stuart Mill. Why does he have the same hairdo as Carrie Fisher does, right, in Star Wars? It's really remarkably close, except for the bald part on top. And then there's the fourth thing that I want you to learn. And that's how to use the growth theory equation that Robert Solow of MIT won his Nobel Prize in economics for thinking up and for teaching us how to use. How to use this growth theory equation to do calculations. That is, how to try to figure out what the level of output per worker in an economy ought to be as a function of a relatively small number of different but important factors. That's a fourth thing that you had better learn. And in fact, let me see how many people can actually learn it. That is, here in the first line, we have our growth equation again. That output per worker, to figure out what output per worker is, you need to take the capital intensity of the economy, which is the savings rate S, divided by this sum of three terms, the population growth rate, the efficiency of labor growth rate, and the depreciation rate, the rate at which capital wears out. You need to take that quotient. You then need to raise that quotient to this rather peculiar exponential power of this parameter alpha over 1 minus alpha. You then need to multiply that whole thing by the efficiency of labor, E. So suppose we have these values for all those parameters. What then is output per worker? What then is output per worker in an economy going to be if it's on its steady state balanced growth path? That's a calculation I want all of you to be able to do, because then you can go out and confront the real world. And if you're trying to understand why is a particular country right now rich, or why is it poor, it will direct you to the factors to look at. And then you can go and a level deeper and say, if in this case this country is poor because its efficiency of labor is very low, you can say what it is. Good, we have a plurality getting the right answer, or at least what I think right now is the right answer. If I remember how to do this, S over n plus g plus delta is 2. Raise it to the alpha over 1 minus alpha power, that's 4. Multiply it by 10,000, you get 40,000 bucks per year. That half of you are already able to do that in real time in 30 seconds is, from my perspective, a good sign. When I was looking over the little bit of arithmetic I've done so far at the start of the course, it struck me we should do a little more math. That is, calculating compound growth rates is a genuinely useful skill to have in the front of your head. That a whole bunch of processes in the world will either take the form of exponential growth or exponential convergence, of quantities that are either moving away from their initial value by an amount that compounds over time, like compound interest, like population growth when there's abundant resources. And being able to have how to analyze such numerical questions in your head is very useful. And then those mathematical skills also carry over to systems that are approaching a stable equilibrium, systems that are undergoing the inverse of exponential growth, that is exponential convergence, in which they're making a constant proportion of the way toward their long-run asymptotic value over time. Now, if things are easy, if we're just doublings or halvings, or some simple multiple of that, you can use the rule of 72, and the rule of 72 you should be able to keep in your heads. Why the rule of 72 rather than the actual number that the engineers will tell us, which is 0.69 something or other? Well, first of all, if you're considering annual growth rates in the range between 2 and 8%, rather than continuously compounded growth rates. 72 is actually a closer approximation than 69 point whatever. And second, 72 is a wonderful number because it has lots of factors, right? 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 9, 12, there's no 5, 18, 24, 36. Divide 72 by any of those numbers, and you get a nice number without a fraction. If you're going to be wanting whole number answers and be able to quickly compute things in your head, it's much better to have a number that when you divide it by a whole bunch of things, you get an answer without a fraction. That's just cognitively easier. That's why we use rule of 72. But if you don't have it easy, well, that's why the one who is made microprocessors for us to use. And you need to figure out which particular formula you want to plug into your calculator. And in general, there are two sets of formulas for going from growth rates on the one hand to cumulative growth factors on the other. And it really depends on whether you're an accountant or an engineer. Right? That accountants take a growth rate, they add 1 to it, and then they raise it to a power t. And engineers, they take the growth rate g, they multiply it by the time t, and then they raise this to the exponential power of the exponential function e, where e is 2.71828. They both work perfectly fine. It's really a cultural difference, whether you're an accountant or an engineer. Let's see if you can use it. Here we have Botswana. Right? GDP per capita in Botswana in 2010 was $15,000 per year, about a third of the U.S. level. But by the context of the world as a whole, not that poor, especially when you consider that GDP per capita in Botswana in 1960 was only $900 per year. How fast did real GDP per capita in Botswana grow, approximately, between 1960 and 2010? So if you got your calculators, now would be a good time. If you want to try to do it in your head, that's fine as well. Okay. All right. We're doing okay. We're flat. Flat's too bad. Right answer is going to be C. And if you want to do it in your head, what you should do is you should take 15,000, divide it by 900, and say that's about 16. And 16, 2, 4, 8, 16. 16 is 4 doublings. And if you have 4 doublings in 50 years, that means you have 1 doubling in about 12 years. And by the rule of 72, a quantity that doubles in 12 years, 72 divided by 12 is 6. So the answer ought to be about 6. And answer C is the only thing that's about 6% per year. So that's the right answer. Or if you're swift with your calculator and can actually make it work on demand so quickly, you could get it that way. That's a very hard thing to do under pressure in 30 seconds. It is, I think, a thing that's worth having in your head. Yeah?
Can you just walk through that?
Okay. All right. Well, 15,000. Do we have a laser pointer? No, we do not have a laser pointer. All right, I'll bring the laser pointer next time, rather than gesture vaguely at the screen. Right? That you go from 900 to 15,000 in your wealth in 50 years. That's about a factor of 16, which is you're doubling it to go from 1 to 2. You're doubling it again to go from 2 to 4. You're doubling it yet a third time to go from 4 to 8. You're doubling it a fourth time to go to 8 to 16. So if it doubles 4 times in 50 years, that means that each doubling takes about 12 years. And how fast is a quantity growing that doubles in 12 years? Well, to determine that, you divide 72 by the amount of time it took to double. And 72 divided by 12 is 6. So it's growing at 6% per year. And that's what answer C is going to be. That's a useful thing to have in your head. Even if you spend most of your life sitting in pointless bureaucratic meetings, because then you can make points and make people impressed and also understand the issue better if you can move back and forward between growth rates and total growth accumulations with relative ease. And indeed, here we have Botswana on Hans Rosling's wonderful gapminder.org website. What's happened to Botswana since 1959 in its rate of economic growth, with all of the kind of shadowed out points being where the countries of the world now are back in 2009. The big red ball being China, the big blue ball being India, this being Nigeria, this being Ethiopia. I've forgotten what this is. Large African country in real trouble. Possibly Zimbabwe. I think it's Zimbabwe. United States, the kind of sun-like thing up there. Japan, the thing with the greatest life expectancy up there. This relatively large pink ball. Between 1959 and 2009, Botswana changes from looking like a typical, underdeveloped, poor, heavily agricultural African country to a country that's kind of smack in the middle of, say, the orange European scatter and significantly richer than most of the yellow South American scatter, with one big difference. Life expectancy in Botswana now is 55 compared to 70 for other countries with about equal levels of GDP per capita. This is because of the AIDS epidemic. An economy with lots of migrant male workers like Botswana and others is going to have a high rate of infection of AIDS, and for reasons I do not understand. AIDS is a much more virulent and destructive disease in Africa than it is in the rest of the world, even conditional on relative levels of wealth, on how much wealth you have to devote to public health and to anti-AIDS drugs, and so forth. Starting in about 1985, you can see the public health of Botswana collapse as life expectancy starts to drop like a stone as people begin dying of AIDS in very large numbers, before recovering somewhat in this past decade. But that public health disaster to the side is the only large negative about Botswana's growth over the past 50 years. Otherwise, it's been an incredible trajectory, while most of the rest of the world is simply growing relatively slowly. The Botswana economy has changed its location and its level of relative prosperity to an astonishing amount. And this is particularly impressive, or perhaps heartbreaking, if you compare Botswana to Zambia. Botswana starts here, Zambia starts here, slightly lower life expectancy, on the other hand, perhaps 40% richer than Botswana back in 1958. Botswana sees its level of material prosperity grow enormously. Zambia simply goes on a big loop and winds up pretty much back where it was, with its level of GDP per capita, of material output per capita today, being more or less what it was back in 1958, and its life expectancy also being pretty much the same. That is, there have been improvements in public health in Zambia, but then the AIDS epidemic hits it as well. And this story of Zambia is particularly heartbreaking Because they're right smack next to each other. Right? This is Botswana, right smack here in southern Africa, just north of South Africa, just to the southwest of Zimbabwe. This is Zambia, just to the north of Zimbabwe. Their borders actually touch at one small point, just at one small point because, say, this part here, this Caprivi Strip, is actually part of the country of Namibia, and it's part of the country of Namibia because the Germans were colonizing Namibia in the late 19th century and taking it over. And the Germans said, damn it, it's really, really important to us that Namibia be as close as possible to the other German colony of Tanzania on the far side. And the British didn't feel like fighting a war in southern Africa to kind of get rid of the German outposts, soldier outposts along this strip. But Botswana and Zambia, both conquered by Britain in the late 19th century, both colonized by the British Empire, both ruled by Britain either directly in the case of Zambia or as a protectorate in the case of Botswana, up until the 1960s. Zambia significantly better off economically come 1960 than Botswana was, largely because of the largest industrial sector and the largest copper mining sector in Africa. Zambia, at the end of the 1950s, spoken of as a country that's kind of in the same level as Portugal in terms of its level of economic development, of industrialization, of literacy. Zambia's gone virtually nowhere in half a century. And that gets us to the main topic of the lecture. Why? Or the more bigger question, why is the world as a whole, so divergent? That we can once again pick up a graph from Gapminder and look at the world as it stood back in 1800. When the Industrial Revolution was still just barely taking hold, when you can already see some signs of significant economic growth relative to a pre-industrial agrarian Malthusian past in Britain, smack here, and in Belgium, smack here, and in the United States and in France. But when for most of the rest of the world, its economies are still overwhelmingly pre-industrial. You're still using water and human muscle and animal power for practically everything, maybe a little wind power in places like the Netherlands that have a lot of wind, maybe not. Life expectancies, absolutely awful. Right? Average woman has maybe 9 pregnancies, of which 7 come to term, of which 3 of the babies then die before the age of 5. And so you're raising 4 children from the age of 5 on up to adulthood, and of those 4 children, only 2 survive to reproduce. That kind of life. That's the world in 1800. This is the world today. Right? With its leading edge, the United States, being 20 times as wealthy as the United States was back in 1800, with life expectancies for virtually the entire world, except for AIDS-ridden Africa, above 60, but with this enormous spreading out of wealth. A whole bunch of countries in Asia and even in Latin America that really aren't all that much richer than the relatively richest parts of the world were back in 1800, and with a bunch of countries in Africa still not very distinguishable from the levels of prosperity we had back in 1800, and everyone else moving up and spreading out in levels of income per capita and income per worker, kind of concentrating in life expectancy, which is kind of nice. That is, we seem to be very good at keeping ourselves from dying as infants right now, and at also keeping ourselves from dying of infectious diseases. That generally we start running into serious trouble in large numbers only when we reach the limits of cell division, as all of our telomeres have worn out, and our next cell division produces something crazy that the body then destroys. That's what tends to happen to us with old age. Otherwise, we're living beyond the Bible's 70 idea of what a full life is. And even countries that are average for the world as a whole, China being average right now, are vastly richer than they were 2 centuries ago. And you can see this process, of growth for a bunch of selected countries. But what you see most of all is not just the general growth, but a substantial amount of divergence. Whether the divergence is the form of an Argentina that starts out looking an awful lot like the United States, and yet now is about a quarter as rich as the United States is. Maybe a third. It's had a good past 5 years. China, China, which still has an enormous gap, a gap of 5 or 6 in its prosperity vis-a-vis Japan just across the North China Sea. And then the places where things have gone really wrong. Zimbabwe being the most recent such example. And you look at this large kind of combination of growth with spreading out. Yeah?
Who are the countries there with the high income and high life expectancy just to the right of the U.S.?
The green dot. I know the orange dot is going to be Luxembourg, which largely indicates that Luxembourg is one large money laundering operation. Or actually, it's not a terribly large money laundering operation. It's a relatively small money laundering operation located in the midst of the Ardennes forest bordering on France, Germany, and Belgium. Kind of one...
Switzerland probably or something?
No. Light green. I've actually forgotten what the light green one is. I suspect that number is simply wrong for the light green one. That is... Well, it might be Kuwait. But
Sorry, I keep seeing the dots.
yeah. If I actually had a working internet connection here, I could find out. So why don't I say we'll find out for next time? So we have this enormous increase in wealth since 1800, and this mammoth increase in spread since 1800. We have countries that stay relatively poor. We have Nigeria's. We have countries that stay relatively rich, like the United States of America. We have Japan's, countries that used to be relatively poor and that are now extraordinarily rich. We also have Argentina's. That is, if you think about it, Argentina in the mid and late 19th century, it looks an awful lot like Canada. Right? Large grasslands on which you can grow lots of wheat and raise lots of sheep and cattle, abundant natural resources, a native Aboriginal Indian population that's kind of devastated with plagues and reduced to a small shadow of its former self, and so unable to resist any form of European immigration and settlement at all. Argentina back in the 19th century really was thought of as very much another Canada or another Australia, or indeed another Western United States, another California, another Oregon, possibly another Colorado. Indeed, come 1914, Buenos Aires, Argentina's capital, is kind of 11th in the world in the fraction of people living in the city who have telephones. Argentina really ought to be up there with the rich countries of the world. It really ought to be up there with Japan and the United States and Luxembourg and Britain and France and all the others, rather than lagging significantly far behind, so that Argentina today is not all that much richer than China. Maybe twice the output per capita level, maybe not. And point out that not being twice as rich as China as a whole means that Argentina is poorer than Greater Shanghai right now, which is extraordinary given that the lower Yangtze Delta in the late 19th century was a place where people were living at an almost subsistence level, while Argentina in the late 19th century was busily investing in telephones, locomotives, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have countries that switch from one to the other. And of those bigger that switch, the most impressive one is China. So let's go back and let's try to take a look at this graph for China being the very large red ball moving itself all over the place, starting here, winding up here. About how much richer has China grown over the past century, or over the past 2 centuries? It's pretty much the same over the past century because in the 19th century, China is pretty much treading water as far as its level of output per capita and labor productivity is concerned. Its population's increasing substantially, and new technologies are being applied. But, you know, more people means smaller farm sizes, and smaller farm sizes means poorer peasants, and poorer peasants means lower wages. Yep, we got a plurality at the correct answer, which is D. 20-fold. 20 times richer today than they were back in 1800. That's kind of the right number to have in your mind for both China and the United States over the past 2 centuries, which is interesting because it indicates that they've both done about equally well in relative terms over the past 2 centuries of industrialization, kind of now. Okay. So in order to try to explain why it is that countries have wound up where they are, we've had our growth model. And a growth model consisted of a simple production function saying that total output Y in the economy as a whole is its capital stock of machines and buildings K raised to this alpha power of this number alpha times the efficiency of labor E times the labor force L, all of it raised to the 1 minus alpha power, where alpha is this particular number that describes the economy. And why do we assume this simple algebraic relationship between the factors of production, capital, and labor, between the diminishing returns, characteristics of technology alpha, between the efficiency of labor E and the total amount of production Y? Well, we want to have some simple rule because we're economists. And if we're political scientists or sociologists or anthropologists, we are allowed to say that things are really complicated. And anyway, they're different in the South and in the Far West. And you have to study each particular village or perhaps each individual person intensely in order to know anything at all. We're economists. We take the opposite. We say, gee, things are complicated, but you can get somewhere by assuming that everyone's identical and every piece of capital equipment's identical and just looking at the very broad relationships. And this is the simplest way of looking at the broad relationships we can come up with that fits a very few requirements. Those requirements are first that we really want a one-parameter production function. We have our factors of production. We have the level of production that the economy is going to accomplish. We just want 1 degree of freedom, 1 number to describe how different economies are. You know, we could have 2 or 3 or 4 dimensional models. We could say there are 2, 3, or 4 parameters in it. But why not just start at 1 and see if that gets us where we want to go? That would be simplest. If this is a 1-parameter model, and if you want to say you have constant returns to scale in labor and capital, that if you double the labor force and double the capital stock, you should double output. And if you want to say that you have diminishing returns to capital, this production function is pretty much the only one you can write down. And it is the only one you can write down if you want your E to actually measure the efficiency of labor. So that the requirement of writing down the simplest rule between resources and production forces you to this particular algebraic production function. And then the simplest other assumptions you can make are that all of the resources in the economy are growing at a constant proportional rate. The constant proportional rate, G, for how better technology and organization enhance the efficiency of labor. The parameter N for the proportional growth rate of population in the labor force. S for the share of production that you're going to save and invest to add to the capital stock. And this kind of delta number for the depreciation rate on the capital stock for how far the depreciation rate wears out. That's our simple model, right? 3 factors of production, 4 rules about how the rates of growth of these factors of production are very simple. 1 rule for the growth of the efficiency of labor, 1 rule for the growth of the labor force, 2 rules for how depreciation reduces and investment increases the capital stock. That plus the production function give us our model. And that model then gives us our magic equation, which I went through last time through the algebra, which the textbook goes through the algebra in much more detail. It's not at all an obvious piece of algebra, even though it's relatively simple. In fact, this was what Robert Solow of MIT got his Nobel Prize in economic science, for figuring out how to construct and use this equation. And this produces the magic equation that you're going to be using for the next week and a half, and that you're going to remember how to use on all of your exams. So I already gave away the answer to this one, but let's see. Rapid retention. Then I'm going to want to use the magic equation from growth theory to try to say how much of U.S. economic growth over the past 2 centuries can we attribute to each of these factors. Yep, and once again, we're 20 times. Good retention, at least for 5 minutes. Hopefully it will stick for much longer. What of this 20-fold growth is attributable to which factors or to which changes in the economy? Well, first, let me backtrack a little bit and say that it's really important to neglect that you haven't had this process of continual economic growth of us becoming 20 times as rich, at least along the leading edge of the world's economy, every 2 centuries or so. This hasn't been going on for very long. In fact, this hasn't been going on in the North Atlantic since before 1800. This hasn't been going on in the world since before 1870. That back before 1800 or 1870, well, we couldn't have been getting much richer over time before then. Why not? Because if we were, we'd have been starving to death. England in 1800 was a relatively rich society. Our estimates of GDP per capita put it as 3 times richer than China, say. Maybe twice as rich as the world average. As best as we can figure out, in England in 1800, the average person was getting 2,322 calories per day, which is a little bit less than you're getting. But you're getting an awful lot of food where you've sacrificed calories for tastiness and for other nutrients, and you're also working a lot less hard than the average worker in England was working back in 1800, when there was very little steam power, when it was indeed animal power or wind or a little water and human muscles. If you kind of read sociology and history, they talk about the spread of the steam engine throughout England in the second half of the 18th century, in the late 1700s. You shouldn't really believe them. Suppose we, well, I don't know, yeah, if we look outside that window, we can see one of the faculty parking lots. If you take 7 of the vehicles parked in that faculty parking lot and add up all of their horsepower, That's the horsepower of all the steam engines in England in 1800. Probably insist that none of the cars be a Prius or a Volt. But if you have say 7 SUVs, that's the horsepower of the steam engines in England. 2,300 calories per day, 48 grams of protein per day. That's 2 ounces. You all are getting at least 8 to 10, as best as we can figure out. Probably shouldn't get much more than that, but 8 to 10. Male height of 5'7". We're closer to 5'9". Life expectancy at birth of 38. England, even in 1800, was very poor. Arguably significantly poorer than our hunter-gatherer ancestors were 10,000 years ago, or than modern forager societies like the Kung of Botswana and Namibia are today, largely because they don't work as much. There's really only about 6 hours of useful stuff you can do in an average day if you live in the Kalahari Desert. And if you're a forager today, you pretty much have to live someplace in the Kalahari Desert that no farmer wants, because otherwise the farmers will have pushed you out. While the people in England in 1800 were managing to work 8.5 hours a day on average, which is really quite a lot if you consider that England is a far northern country, and so there are a lot of months in the year when it's dark. I think in Scotland, the sun rises at 10 a.m. on December 21st and sets at 2 p.m. And so there's really only 6 hours of daylight total. And before modern artificial light, it's really expensive to try to keep things illuminated after that. So modern economic growth, as we know it, starts in 1800. And indeed, if we go back to Greg Clark's calculations of what the English construction workers hired by monks and guildmasters actually made, we can see that. That is, monks and also guildmasters in towns who had to report to their members how they had spent the guild's money tended to write things down, how much they paid to the construction workers they hired to build buildings. And they also tended to write down how much they paid for staples like flour and butter and oil and, pieces of wood and so forth. We can divide the daily wages of construction workers by an appropriate price index of the cost of necessities, and this is what Greg Clark gets going back to 1200 for the real wages of construction workers in England. Now, going back toward 1200 or so, these kinds of calculations can go wrong in 2 ways as indicators of how well off a society is. First, you're not at all sure whether the construction workers you're hiring are especially skilled workers who thus get paid more than the average guy, or especially unskilled workers who get paid less than the average. We just don't know. Probably not a big effect, but we don't know. Second, we really don't know whether construction workers are highly paid because you have to pull them out of their farming and craft occupations to get them to come to the monastery and build something. So you have to make it worth their while to come and work, or whether they pay them relatively less than average because they're younger sons. People who are the 4th surviving son of a farm family that had a small farm already, so you tell son number 4 to go and get lost. There's not enough land for you to live on this farm as well. You have to go and find your fortune someplace else. A month later, you're starving to death and begging by the side of the road, and if a monk comes along and says, "Here, I'll pay you a pittance if you come help build us a monastery building," you'll jump at it. You really don't know whether these numbers are premium wages for people who have to be pulled out of settled occupations to do this kind of work, or whether they're people who would otherwise be starving to death who are willing to take anything. Those factors can't really affect the number by anything like the difference between 1800 and today. And what we have is we have before 1800 a long period of time in which human standards of living, even in relatively rich countries, look to have been pretty stagnant. And then this explosion of productivity that has happened since, that's starting in 1800 or so. And at times I play with saying we really should start in 1870 or so rather than in 1800. That is, between 1800 and 1870, you have two really big things going right with the world economy, or at least with the world economy in the North Atlantic, in the rich countries of the North Atlantic. And the first is figuring out how to use steam-powered machines to take the fibers of the cotton plant and to spin the cotton fibers first into thread and then to weave the cotton fibers into kind of cloth, and to make not just cotton cloth, but with better machines to make woolen cloth as well. You know, that steam-powered automatic textile factories, they're a big jump in human standards of living, simply because before you have machines, making clothes is an important and extraordinarily labor-intensive process. And you can see signs of this if you look back in our collective literary record. You know, I should have made an iClicker question about this. But, like, say, if you go and if you read, you know, the Odyssey, Odysseus, king of Ithaca, trying to get back home from the Trojan War, has a very difficult time having angered a bunch of gods along the way who are kind of vindictive sons of a bitches, and are trying very hard to make his life difficult. On his way back, he runs into an incredible number of women of one form or another. Some of them are enchantresses who turn his sailors into pigs. One of them is a young princess who is playing by the side of the beach with her friends when he gets washed up. What are the rest of them all doing when he meets them? What one activity are they doing? Whether they're a maid in his household when he returns to Ithaca in disguise, or whether they are Helen, Queen of Sparta herself. Anyone want to guess what they're doing? Close. They're weaving. Right? Helen of Troy, right? The daughter of Zeus and Leda, supposedly the most beautiful woman in classical Greece, the reason for the whole Trojan War. After the war, after her husband Menelaus recaptures her from Paris the Trojan, kind of not to her liking, and takes her back to Sparta, where she's Queen of Sparta again, what's she doing when people show up? You know, she's not eating grapes or lounging around or listening to poetry. She's kind of sitting there at the loom, kind of throwing the warp and the weft across each other to make cloth. From 1800 to 1870, you get steam engines, you get automated textile machinery, and you get railroads. And that's the overwhelming bulk of improvements in output per capita between 1800 and 1870, the application of those three technologies. It's only after 1870 that you get the general burst of invention and innovation in the economy as a whole rather than a couple of leading sectors. That's why I'll get confused during this course, and sometimes I'll say modern economic growth begins in 1800, and sometimes I'll say modern economic growth begins in 1870, because I'm kind of ambivalent about whether to count the railroad and textile revolutions of 1800 to 1870 as the last gasp of medieval technological progress or the first gasp of modern. So what does our magic equation tell us about this 20-fold increase in output per capita in the United States over the past 2 centuries? You have GDP per capita on the leading edge, up by a factor of 20 in the United States, and up by a factor of 10 in Great Britain, in the United Kingdom since 1800. Over that period, you also have population growth N in the United States, down from 3% to 1% per year. And a country that has a slower rate of population growth should be a richer country. After all, this n is here in the denominator. That means that if your population growth rate is lower, then this term inside these parentheses will be higher. The capital intensity of your economy will be greater. And a higher capital intensity raised to this particular power is going to mean a more prosperous economy. Why is it that an economy with a lower population growth rate is in general going to be a more prosperous one? Well, if you're saving and investing the same amount, and if your capital stock is wearing out at the same amount, then if your population growth rate is lower, more of the machines you make to add to your capital stock can go to help existing workers increase the machinery at their disposal, can make their production process more capital intensive, and thus make what they produce over the course of their workday more productive, larger. If the population growth rate is higher, well, then your labor force is growing rapidly, so a whole bunch of your savings and investment has to go to providing your new workers with the same amount and kinds of machines that your old worker already had. That a faster population growth rate economy has more investment diverted to simply giving the new workers the same capital stock the old workers were used to working with, rather than adding to the capital that each worker can use to be more productive. That's why an economy with a lower population growth rate is probably going to be more productive. Similarly, an economy with a higher savings rate is going to be more productive as well, also through this capital intensity channel. Save and invest more, and your average worker will have more machines and better buildings in which to work, and will become more productive. Why does the savings investment share increase over the past 2 centuries? Some of it is because of better financial markets that make it a lot easier to save. Nowadays, you can save and put your money off in a bank or in Wall Street or whatever, and if you've properly diversified, and if you're not unlucky, and if you don't invest with Bernie Madoff or somebody else of that ilk, your money will still be there for you to get out when you come back. In fact, it'll hopefully be amplified. By contrast, back in 1800, you invest. God knows if you're ever going to get your money back, or if they're just going to steal it, or falsely report the ship was lost, when in fact it arrived home perfectly well. Better financial markets, better control, better financial regulation mean that your likelihood of getting something out of your personal savings is going to be higher, and that's going to be push up your savings rate. Even if the people you're dealing with aren't quite so straightforward or honest with their dealings. How many people have seen The Social Network? Okay. Not quite part of our common culture. Movie worth seeing. Makes Harvard undergraduate life out to be a much more dissolute place than it actually is. And also makes Harvard's climate out to be much better than it actually is. There are no scenes of absolute total slush and rain. Generally, it's just people are wearing attractive parkas in the winter, which doesn't quite fit. One of the characters in there thinks he has a 1/4 share of Facebook and winds up, after a bunch of financial manipulations, with a 1/50th share of ownership of Facebook, Eduardo. But thanks to the American legal system, Eduardo now has $1 billion, which is a very nice return for investing the first $1,000 in Facebook, and which shows that even if you don't think your partners have treated you right, the fact that there's an effective court system means that you can invest $1,000 in your roommate's harebrained internet venture, and if it turns out to be profitable beyond anyone's wildest dreams, you can earn a very high return on it. The second reason that savings rates are higher is because rich economies are very good at making machines, which means that the same savings effort you make produces a much larger investment outcome. When the things you can make are various complicated, fancy pieces of electronic equipment, rather than things made out of wood that you hope won't sink. That, too, has to do with the increase in the savings investment share. How much of this growth that we've seen over the past 200 years can these two factors account for? Well, if you want to assume a diminishing returns parameter of 0.5, then a doubling of savings investment rates, that would double your output per capita. That if your diminishing returns factor alpha is 0.5, then you get 0.5 divided by 0.5 up here in the exponent, so that's just a 1. So then your output per worker is going to be proportional to your capital intensity, and your capital intensity is going to be proportional to your savings investment share. So if you double the share of the economy that's savings, you're going to double output per worker as well. We did that. That's one of the doublings that's brought the United States from where it was in 1800 to 20 times its current level today. Yeah? It can't be more than 1, right? Or at least unless it could be more than 1, but that's a science fiction scenario called the singularity or something, in which you add to the capital stock and that produces more, in which a 1 percentage point increase in the capital stock generates a more than 1% increase in output. If Chad Jones, who we lost to Stanford, I think 4 years ago, it was really quite sad, right, that Chad was comparing his Berkeley offer and his Stanford offer, and he computed that he could pay for someone to drive him from Berkeley to Stanford and back, and sit in the back of the limousine surfing the internet and writing his papers for 1/3 of the salary differential between Stanford and Berkeley. And the only thing on the other side was that his office view at Stanford is really lousy. While at Berkeley, he had a 6th-floor office in Evans Hall, one of those looking straight west at the Golden Gate. And he's looking at the Golden Gate from 100 feet above the Berkeley campus. And there's nothing that, we had a plan to set up a webcam showing the view from his office and broadcast it and tell him to come look at it and hope he'd come back. It hasn't worked. It never worked. If Chad were here, we'd talk a bunch about those kinds of situations in which the capital share of the economy, in which there really are no diminishing returns. Paul Romer at Stanford also likes to talk about such models. I don't think they're right. I think alpha's going to be less than 1. That it's certainly not the case that my productivity or any of our productivity, by a second laptop, my productivity doesn't double. It is certainly true that I seem to want to have 7 microprocessors surrounding me when I lecture, but that appears to be it. And an alpha of 1 or higher would seem to indicate that, that there never is any reduction in how productive things are, that people are kind of a 0 in the production function. That's just things that make things and not people. And that may be true someday, in which we're all replaced by robots, but not now. Now people are still important. So doubling from the doubling of savings investment rates. The fall in population growth rates from 3% to 1% per year in the United States. You feed that back into our equation with an efficiency growth rate of labor of the 2% per year that we've seen over the past century and a half, and a 3 or 4% per year depreciation rate, shrinking n from 3% down to 1%, that's going to diminish the denominator by enough to boost capital intensity by enough to maybe boost output per capita by an extra 1/3 because we're a low population growth economy now, rather than a high population growth economy now. And you multiply these things together, and maybe you can account for a tripling of output per capita since 1800. But that still leaves a factor of 7 for the United States. So the conclusion is that the United States now were richer than our counterparts were in 1800, that of that we're about 3 times richer than our counterparts were back in 1800 because we have more resources per worker to apply because we have slower population growth and a higher investment share. But then there's another factor of 7 because the efficiency of our labor is higher, because we have access to more and better technologies and more and better forms of productive organization than we had back in 1800. So the efficiency of labor is the place to get most of the story. We have better educated workers, we have better technologies, and here I kind of have to drop the subject, because if you want to know what makes for better technologies, you really should apply to Shankar Shastri and his engineering school. We have better organizations, but if you really want to know what makes for better organizations, well, you should probably go up to Haas and talk to Rich Lyons' people and the Haas professors about business organization. That we economists have to take a broader view and say, what happened, can we make happen, can governments do to speed this progress, which is primarily technological and secondarily organizational progress. And, you know, that's a good place to stop. And let me say, next time I'll pick up with looking not at why are we so much richer than we were back in 1800, than our counterparts were back in 1800, but how can we understand something like the United States now being so rich? And Haiti, right? Haiti, that back in 1800 was about as rich as the United States was back in 1800. Haiti is now so very, very poor.